From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, my name is Stephen Winick, and we're here at the Library of Congress where we will be interviewing Billy Bragg. I should also introduce my co-interviewer. This is Mary Sue Twohy of SiriusXM Radio.
Thank you.
So, Billy, you're here because you've written a book about skiffle, and so we're going to talk a bit about folk music and skiffle and their interrelations. So I'm going to start out by mentioning that I'm pretty sure that back in the 80s, I saw you perform some traditional songs in your sets way back then. So when did you first become aware of traditional song, and did you always incorporate them into your gigs a little bit?
Well, I became aware of traditional song via a rather circuitous route. I was really into Simon and Garfunkel when I was like 12 or 13, and they kind of introduced me to Scarborough Fair, which is an English folk song. Two guys from Brooklyn.
Right.
We're going to get a lot of that today, I think. And that kind of led me to sort of Dylan and other American singer-songwriters. But I was always aware that they had drawn some inspiration from British folk music. In 1973 or 4, our local library opened a record section, and it was predominantly classical music, but they had a lot of album samplers from the Topic label. Topic, which is a great British folk label from the 1930s. It was originally the Communist Party record label, the workers' record label. And what they did was they anthologized folk songs around a theme. So they would have war, work, the sea, you know. And I sort of avidly listened to these songs. And so that introduced me to people like Shirley and Dolly Collins, the Watersons, Bert Lloyd. And so I kind of then had a sort of knowledge of folk music. But when punk happened in 1977, being year zero,
right,
all that kind of went out the window until in 1984, when the coal miners were on strike for a year. Because I was a solo performer, I was able to go into the coalfields and do gigs. And one of the very first shows that I did up in Sunderland, there was an old guy named Jock Purden, an old miner, retired miner, who sat on stage. He was opening for me. He sat on stage with his hand cupped over his ear, and his songs were so much more radical than mine. And I felt a bit embarrassed, really, because I'm supposed to, you know, I'm the little punk rocker and everything, you know, come up here. And I felt really embarrassed about it. And he was so kind to me, because what he said explicitly to me was that, you know, whatever my relationship to this material, now that I'd done a gig for the miners, I was part of this tradition. And that's the way it's always been. I mean, you know, since then I've always thought of myself, I'm not of the tradition, clearly, but I am part of it. And I kind of went back to those records that I knew and those songs I remembered, and started to bring that influence into my own songwriting. The first example of that will be Between the Wars. And that kind of became the defining Billy Bragg political song, got me in the charts. I played on Top of the Pops. So it was the miners' strike really that reconnected me with my own traditional music.
Yeah, that's great. Although I should say many people noticed that the beginning of A New England sounds suspiciously like Paul Simon.
Well, I may have borrowed those two lines, but in my defence, I started writing that song when I was 21 years old, and then I came back to it when I was 22. So
it did make sense.
At the time, it made a lot of sense. And also, I didn't realise that Kirsty MacColl was going to have a top 10 hit with it and make it famous. I just thought it would be some obscure little song that I played at parties. So that's my defence. And give Paul Simon his due. He spoke to me about that, and he's pretty cool with it. So I think I got away with it.
Great.
So as you referenced your involvement with punk, how did you actually get started in punk? How did that leap happen?
Well, in the summer of 1977, maybe it must have been earlier than that, it must have been the summer of 1976. The summer of 1976, there was something going on in the UK. There was a band called Dr. Feelgood, who were kind of playing sort of maximum R&B, and they had a lead guitar player called Wilco Johnson, who looked like the sort of kid at my school who would get beat up all the time. You know, he had sort of a weird haircut and he had his top button done up, but he was cool. Somehow he was cool. How was this geeky looking bloke incredibly cool? And in some way it was like a precursor of punk rock, because within 12 months, lots of unprepossessing blokes like Elvis Costello and Ian Dury, Johnny Rotten and Joe Strummer was suddenly cool. So there was hope for all of us. And what happened was that summer, I was playing a little band with my mates in our parents' back rooms, and we went out and bought the first Who record, the first Stones record, and the first Small Faces record, and we were kind of trying to aim for that sort of sound. And then we heard the Jam, who were kind of right in that nexus, but they were our age, which blew our minds. So we went to see the Jam playing a little pub called Nashville Rooms, and their next show was at the Rainbow, which is the sort of prime London rock place where we'd been to see. We'd seen the Small Faces there the year before, the Small Faces revival. But they were playing with the Clash, and we went along to that gig, really ostensibly to see the Jam. But the Clash just blew us away because they were our age, and they were doing all the things we liked about the Stones and the Small Faces and the Who. So it was kind of a catalytic moment. We'd been to see the Stones and the Who that year, and the Stones were at Earl's Court. It was this massive arena. It was the first proper arena show in the UK, and the Who were played at Charlton Football Club. It was like, you know, they were miles away. And here was the Jam and the Clash, not only physically close to us, but close to us culturally as well. And I think that was a catalyst. You know, I went home and gave away all my Eagles albums, cut my hair, and bought a pair of plastic trousers.
That's simple.
Really. Yeah, I didn't really change my songwriting much, but it's that straightforward in those days, yeah.
So it was the minor strike that got you to do political songs, though, specifically?
No, well, I think I was doing political songs. I think punk was quite political. The political side of punk I'd always been into. And the first political activism I ever took part in was Rock Against Racism, and that was in '78. So I was clearly at a kind of what you might call personal politics, I suppose. What's significant about the miners' strike with regard to my songwriting is it turns me into an ideological songwriter. Because at the same time as the miners' strike happens, 1984, I come to America for the first time. Now, in the UK, people see me on my own playing guitar, they call me a one-man Clash. In the United States of America, people compare me to Woody Guthrie. Right. Now, Woody Guthrie, I knew who Woody Guthrie was because I was a big Dylan fan, but it was very difficult to find Woody's records in where I lived, anyway, in London, in the 70s. Eventually, just to hear what he sounded like, I eventually managed to track down a cassette on the Disques du Monde label, the French Disques du Monde. We even spelled his name wrong. On the cover, they spelled his name with IE, Woody, with an IE. And there was no details, just the track list. And I can remember playing it, and it sounded so primal that I thought, I can't do this. This sounds awful. This is before punk. Right. So when I came to the United States of America, I was one of the most amazing things about coming to the United States of America was record shops. Because there's so much great music that you don't get in English record shops. And of course, there were Woody's records. So I was able to now buy Woody's records and buy perhaps the greatest of all of his records, which is the Library of Congress recordings that he did with Alan Lomax in, I think, 1941, I think. That really, where Woody's just sitting there talking, weirdly similar to what we're doing now, Stephen. It's just occurred to me. It's a bit strange. Yeah.
Well, some of that was done in this suite of rooms.
Yeah.
Although some of it was done in a different building.
Yeah. I mean, that's just
right here.
That's just occurred to me there for a second. So, but yeah, those recordings really helped me to understand Woody. But also, I also came across Joe Hill, who I'd never come across at all. I didn't know anything about Joe whatsoever. And I think I bought Utah Phillips' album, You Have Fed Us. We Have Fed You for 1,000 Years. What a great record that is. Yeah. And I think that has Power in the Union on it. And I took that home, and in the midst of the strike, I needed to write a union song. And I was familiar with a song from the American Civil War called Rally Round the Flag, which Ry Cooder had recorded for the Long Riders soundtrack. And I sort of borrowed the tune from that. The chorus of that song is The Union Forever, Hurrah, Boys, Hurrah. So I borrowed that tune, and I borrowed Joe Hill's title, Power in the Union, and I wrote a new set of lyrics for that. So, and was later very happy to find subsequently that the tune for Rally Round the Flag was stolen from an English hymn. So once again, what goes around comes around.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're going to say that a lot in this conversation, I feel.
I guess another example of that is that much later in your career, you were approached by Nora Guthrie and the Guthrie family to write music to Woody's lyrics. So how did that come about?
Well, that came about, I was doing a gig in Central Park for Woody's 90th birthday with Pete Seeger and Arlo and the Disposable Heroes of Hip-Hoprisy. I'd had a few run-ins with the Guthrie legend before. One of the most daunting moments I ever faced as a performer was at the Vancouver Folk Festival in 1987, where I'd been asked if I'd be interested to do a Woody Guthrie workshop. You know what a workshop is at a folk festival, you know, where 3 or 4 artists sit around and I take it in turns to play songs, and there's a theme. And I thought, you know, you have to play 3 songs. I thought, I know 3 Woody songs. How hard can that be, you know? I didn't think any more about it till the day. And when I got there, the other 3 participants were Pete Seeger, Arlo Guthrie, and Rambling Jack Elliott.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I suddenly thought, I am so busted here. If any of these played the 3 songs I know, I'm finished. But Jack, who sat next to me, on top of his guitar, on top of the body of his guitar, he had a bit of paper taped on with loads of Woody titles on, which I suppose was like an aid de memoir for him. So I was looking at, oh yeah, I know that one. You know, as you know him through osmosis, don't you? Because you've listened to all those, oh yeah, yeah. So I kind of got away with it. I got away with it until old man Seeger stood up at the end like a sort of tall redwood tree and began, in his beautiful clear tones, began singing This Land Is Your Land. And then he threw it to Arlo for the next verse. I thought, uh-oh. And then he threw it to Jack. It's getting closer to me. And I'm like, this is it. So I just had to say, look, I'm really sorry. Look, we don't sing this in England. This land ain't my land, clearly. And I apologise. And I think Nora took pity on me. And by inviting me to come and look at the songs in the archive, she kind of brought me into the family. It was a really amazing experience, because not only was Nora there with the archivist with, at the time, 2,000 complete lyrics that Woody had written as songs. The only reason nobody played them was because, like myself, Woody didn't write musical notation.
Right.
When he writes a song, if I write a song, what you get is a piece of paper with words on, and the words, they rhyme and they have a meter to them, you know, but there's no hint of what the tune is, because I've got it here. It's easy me now because I just record it on my computer, so you know, but for Woody, he only actually recorded 10% of the songs he wrote. So all of these songs were languishing in files, waiting to be brought back to life. And Nora's genius idea was to bring some people in to do that. Yeah. But it wasn't just Nora, because also in the office was Woody's old manager, Harold Leventhal. Right. And the thing about Harold was, because he was there, if I found a lyric that referred to something that happened in the 30s, I could go in to see Harold and he could explain to me what the context was. You know, I found a song about Hans Eisler, who's the guy who wrote the East German national anthem. That's all I knew. And I'm like, why is Woody writing a song about Hans Eisler? So I go in to see Harold, and he tells me this incredible story. Each of the verses is another note of Eisler's brother was the Comintern agent in Hollywood in the 1940s. Wow. And their sister betrayed them to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and another character was a Dixiecrat senator who was, you know, pushing this kind of what amounted really to a kind of a pogrom on Jewish American intellectuals. I mean, the whole thing just came out of Harold and this song. It was just an incredible privilege to sit and talk to him. Yeah. And all he ever asked me to do was, whenever I came, he asked me to bring him a copy of the British Communist newspaper, The Morning Star. Wow. Now, I don't know if he was like testing me or anything, but and it wasn't easy to find. Oh, you can't find it everywhere. There's only particular shops. But I always try to find a copy of him, and he would always ask me about, you know, what's happening with the Communist Party. I'm not, Harold, it's like, it's not there. I can tell you about Tony Blair, but it's not there. But he was an amazing, amazing character. He was a co-founder of the Newport Folk Festival, and he had a huge, huge history. And he'd been a song plugger for Irving Berlin. Right. There was a picture on the wall behind him of him with like a 19-year-old Frank Sinatra in the 1940s, the skinniest Frank Sinatra you've ever seen, in this suit that like was drowning him. And so Harold was like it was a real privilege to have sat and talked to him and listened to him talk. Amazing guy.
So you spoke of Pete Seeger, and when we saw you at the Folk Alliance International Conference in Kansas City, you referenced Pete Seeger. What is your relationship with him?
Well, I think Pete is the person who really first properly connected me to Woody. You know, nice. I first encountered him in East Germany, actually, at a political folk song festival there in 1987. Wow. A peace concert, and he was, he was aware of who I was. I'm not sure he knew much of my material, but again, he was someone else who always encouraged me to write political songs. At another folk festival at Vancouver in '89, just after Tiananmen Square had happened. Oh. I was in the chow tent there, the artist chow tent, and Uncle Pete came and sat down and said, "Listen, I'm going to finish my set tomorrow night on the main stage by singing the Internationale in respect of the students who've been singing it in the Tiananmen Square. And he said, and Bruce Cockburn is going to come and sing the Canadian version, and someone's going to come and sing the Mexican version. I'd like you to come and sing the British version, Billy. And I was like, oh, Pete, give me a break, mate. But, you know, the lyrics are arise, ye starvelings from your slumbers, arise, ye criminals of want, for reason in revolt now slumbers, and here ends the age of cant. I said, Pete, it doesn't even rhyme, you know. So he said, well, maybe you should just write a new verse. And in folk music, there are some people you can't tell to piss off, and Uncle Pete is one of them. So before I didn't even have a chance to say, don't be daft, Pete, rewrite the Internationale, he found a flyer. It actually was a flyer about a demonstration in support of Tiananmen Square. He got a pencil and he closed his eyes and he began singing under his breath the original French lyric. And he would write down a verbatim the first verse and the chorus. He said, there you go, you got 24 hours. Like I said, you can't really say it's like homework from a professor. So I wrote a verse and a chorus, and I came back and I sang it, and it was all good. And then the Berlin Wall came down the same year, and all of our sort of left-wing culture was being put in a skip out the back. Everything, not just the bad stuff that needed to go in there, the stuff that was tarnished with totalitarianism, but the good stuff was going in the skip as well. So I thought, well, maybe I should rewrite the Internationale and record it. Maybe that's what. So I wrote some more verses and I sent them to Pete, and I went to see Ewan McCall and Peggy and sort of said to them, look, I've written these verses, what do you think? And I recorded it, put it out on an album in 1990, and now if you get the IWW Little Red Songbook, my version is in there next to the original.
Right
Isn't
on.
that incredible?
That's great.
amazing.
That's Uncle Pete. That's Pete. You can't say no to Pete Seeger.
Right.
No.
So, as I mentioned, one of the reasons that we're interviewing you is your book on Skiffle, and you talked before the interview about how Skiffle kind of throws the American audience. People in this country don't really know what Skiffle is. So give us a little introduction. What is Skiffle, and what led you to become interested in it?
Well, the 140 characters answer to that question is Skiffle is basically British schoolboys in the 1950s playing lead belly songs, basically.
All right.
What it represents the introduction of the guitar into British pop culture, and it's a moment when our pop music goes from being a jazz-based confection for grown-ups, in which anyone who's not a grown-up is offered novelty songs like How Much Is That Dog in the Window. It changes from that to being a guitar-led music for teenagers. And Skiffle, the catalyst for this is a guy named Lonnie Donegan, who has a hit in 1956 with a version of Leadbelly's Rock Island Line. Now, Donegan is the banjo player in a trad jazz band, the Chris Barber jazz band, and he records Rock Island Line for a trad jazz album called New Orleans Joys in July 1954. And Skiffle emerges from trad jazz because the British trad guys who are interested in playing New Orleans jazz, trad jazz means jazz from New Orleans, predominantly that was made before 1915. What's significant in 1915 is when bands start going north and recording, the original Dixieland Jazz Band and these groups start recording jazz, and the thing starts moving forward. New Orleans jazz has no soloists. It's a collective effort. Everyone plays around the rhythm and around the tune. So someone like Louis Armstrong playing solos, that's a different type of jazz as far as the purists are concerned. But the British trad jazz fans, they were unable to find anyone to teach them to play this stuff. So they only had the records that were predominantly made in the 1920s recordings. And because of the primitive nature of the recording equipment, the musicians had to blow really hard to be heard, which is part of the reason why jazz has that pep that they used to call pep to it. It's kind of like they're blasting it out. So the British guys didn't have much technique, so they just blew like Billy-O on their instruments. And as a result, after 30 minutes, their lips were so numb they couldn't play anymore. So in order not to lose their audience, they would pick up acoustic guitars, a washboard for rhythm, and use the double bass from the jazz band, and they will play broadly Leadbelly's repertoire. And Leadbelly is significant because steady now. He's the greatest folk singer that America ever produced, both as a writer of songs, an interpreter of songs, and a collector of songs. I know it's arguable to say that in this place and on your show, but
We can go along with that.
as an outsider, I think, you know, you've got to remember, as far as Woody was concerned, Leadbelly was to him as Woody was to Bob. You know, he was physically a giant, but also I think in American culture, he's a giant as well. He's the folk Shakespeare. He's that, you know, that guy they always wanted to, because, you know, Woody was a genius too, but Woody read, he wrote, he could type, you know, he'd had a decent education. Leadbelly he made himself, you know, and you can hear it in the music. So Leadbelly's vast repertoire, which includes, I mean, I read somewhere about Leadbelly and Blind Lemon Jefferson playing a song called Seven Drunken Nights, which is an old Jacobean drinking song. Where they got it from, I have no idea. But if they were playing that and Rock Island Line, you know, that's a pretty broad scope. So the jazzers decided to play these Leadbelly songs, partly because they believed that the blues predated traditional jazz, which I don't think is actually true. The 12-bar form as we know it, I think, postdates trad jazz. But I think it was because the trad jazzers in New Orleans used the phrase blues when they meant an informal jam, and I think that could slightly confuse them. Anyway, so they started playing these, what they called a breakdown session with the acoustic guitars and stuff, and that became really popular. In some cases, in some events, it became more popular than the trad jazz itself, particularly with teenagers, because teenagers wanted to jive, and they couldn't do that in a ballroom in the UK, because ballroom dancing, I don't know if this is true in the United States of America, but in the UK, ballroom dancing is processional. The dancers, you know, go in a huge sweeping circle, whereas jiving is more static. All right, they move back and forth, but they don't move around in procession. So if you've got kids jiving and adults ballroom dance, you're going to get a traffic jam, you get a snarl up. So jiving was banned. So these kids went to these trad jazz gigs and they kind of jived, and then along comes Lonnie Donegan and he's giving it loads with Rock Island Line, and it's you know, it's up tempo enough to engage them. So it becomes really, really popular.
Can you expand on Rock Island Line, the song?
Yeah, of course, yeah. The song Rock Island Line begins its life as a glee club song for the Rock Island Line Railway, written by engineers in the Biddle shops, which is the engineering workshops in the suburbs of Little Rock, Arkansas. And they were encouraged by they're African American workers. They were encouraged by the company to form a vocal group and to go to public events like picnics or to meetings or church socials and sing the praises of the Rock Island Line. And there are quite a few songs about Rock Island. There's one that the original tune to I'm not going to be able to remember the name of it now. One of the early great American railroad songs about the train that takes the hobos to heaven.
Right.
Help me out, yeah.
Okay.
I'll think of it in a minute.
Yeah.
The tune of that was originally Wabash Cannonball.
Right.
The Wabash Cannonball was originally, the tune of that was originally about the great Rock Island route that was originally called. So, you know, it's not a one-off. It's something that was going on in the golden age of railway. That's how they promoted the railways. But we first come across it those of us outside Arkansas, when it's recorded by John A. Lomax, accompanied by Leadbelly, who's kind of roadieing for him, in Cummins Prison Farm in southern Arkansas in 1935. Lomax is recording songs for the Library of Congress, work songs, and he believes that people who are in prison are closer to the folk source because they've not been listening to the radio for the last 10 years. He's concerned about radio may undermine the folk process. So he's recording these work songs. And an octet led by an inmate named Kelly Pace comes before the microphone, and they sing Rock Island Line as a call and response song. And unfortunately, Lomax or Leadbelly never actually asked them if it's a work song or not. So the question of whether or not it's a work song or just a song they sung, I think is still debatable, because I'm not sure, it's quite a fast song. What work you could possibly do? You certainly couldn't chop an axe. Leadbelly turned it into chopping song. He started it off as a chopping song, but so anyway, John Lomax records the song on a piece of equipment the size of a sort of domestic fridge, and he needs that. That's how he records songs. Leadbelly only needs to hear a song a couple of times, and he's got it. He takes it away. He steals a couple of lines from nursery rhymes, Cat in the Cupboard, and some traditional blues lines, and he turns it into the song that we know. He kind of adds to it. He bolts stuff onto it, and when he goes out with Lomax to give talks to academics at universities on the East Coast, he's in a bit of a quandary with this song, because for those songs that he learned through the oral tradition, he has a context for them. He says, you know, when we sang this song, we did this. You know, this is, I mean, he's the first vernacular singer to ever do this kind of thing in American culture. And so he's, you know, the academics sitting there have never seen a blues singer like this in front of him, so they want to know the context, but he has no context for Rock Iron Line. He's got a great song, but he's got no context. So he remembers that they recorded it by the wood pile. So he starts off talking about it as a chopping song, but then after a couple of years, it kind of transforms itself into this story about a train driver and he calls him a depot agent, I think, but he's actually will be a signalman, I imagine, and he's telling the train driver that the train's got to go in the hole because there's an express train coming. In the golden age of railroad, freight trains have to give way to express trains. But there's an exemption on animal welfare grounds if you're carrying livestock. So he says to the Leadbelly says to the depot agent, I've got pigs, I've got horses, I've got all livestock. He said, okay, you can go. And then he goes down the line, he shouts back to him, I fooled you, I've got pig iron, which may be a pun. And it's that version which finally develops into the story that we're familiar with. And Donegan, I think, uses one of the later versions recorded in the 1940s as his model. But he adds to the story again by introducing a toll gate into the story. The train's got to pay a toll because of what it has on it. It's like a tariff, really. It's like the idea of a tariff going across a border. But of course, there never was a toll gate on American railroads, you know. So Donegan is kind of adding to it in a way that Leadbelly did. But the interesting thing about Donegan's version is, by bringing in the toll gate, he's kind of watermarked it as his version. So if you ever hear a version of Rock On Line and it's got a toll gate in it, that person has not been listening to Leadbelly, they've been listening to Lonnie Donegan. And I have to say, Johnny Cash's first album for Sun Records opens with Rock Iron Line, and he mentions the toll gate. So that's a very interesting, for me, that's a very, very interesting, there's a saying in folk music, what goes around comes around.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever heard that, Steve.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, Johnny was not necessarily aware that he learned it from someone who had learned it from Lonnie Donegan, if you know what I mean. It became so much a part of popular culture for that short time.
It was a huge hit. I mean, Donegan got to number 8 in the American charts, and there were a dozen copyists.
Right.
If I remember rightly, Rob McEwen's first band, he recorded it. The guy who became the voice of the Jolly Green Giant, he did it. There was a kind of awesome. Uncle Dave Macon type of guy, he recorded a version of it as well. And they all mentioned the toll gate. They all mentioned the toll gate. It's. I mean, you know, I don't know if Lonnie knew this, but he kind of like recast the song for a new generation.
I think he just didn't understand what the situation was that
I think he was trying to make sense of it. I think he was trying to make sense of it in his own mind.
Right.
Because he also says the train goes to New Orleans. So Rock Iron Line never went to New Orleans, and it's possible that Leadbelly might be saying Moulin. Now Moulin is the county in which Rock Island is. It's one of the Tri-Cities up near Davenport. So you may have been talking about that.
So, but speaking of what goes around comes around, I mean, one of the reasons that we at the Library of Congress are so interested in the Skiffle story is that Leadbelly and John Lomax were making that recording for the Library of Congress.
That's right.
And so that recording is here. It was made for us, and we still have it. And you were actually able to look at the sleeve from it.
That was an amazing thing to see John Lomax's handwriting on there.
Yeah.
And his notes from that day was that was a sort of a wow moment for me.
So one of the things that's interesting to us is the question of how this recording from the Library of Congress ends up in Lonnie Donegan's repertoire.
Yeah. Well, in the years after World War II, the American government created something called the United States Information Service, which was set up to propagate American culture around the world. And it mostly took the form of libraries closely associated with your embassies. In Grosvenor Square in London, directly across the road from across the square from the embassy, there was a USIS building. And again, it was predominantly books, but in the basement there was a record library, and the record library was the Library of Congress recordings, the entire catalogue of the Library of Congress recordings. And if you gave them your name and address, you could borrow one of those recordings. So it's highly likely that the Skifflers were getting their material, because you couldn't kind of buy Leadbelly records. You know, Leadbelly wasn't released in the UK those days. You could only really get them on import. And you had to then know someone who went to America in order to do that. So to be able to have access to those records on a library basis was very, very important to those guys. And a number of them that I spoke to were very angry about Donegan, because he used to borrow the records and keep them. And he went, because Ron Gould, who's one of the interviewees, told me that he went into the Library of Congress, and they checked for, I think it was he said it was Muddy Waters at Stovall Farm, Alan Lomax's recording of Muddy at Stovall Farm, and he looked at it and he said, well, it's been loaned out to a T. Donegan. His real name was Tony Donegan, and unfortunately he's lost it. And Ron Gould was like, but Donegan's rationale was that the library, the American embassy could always buy a new copy. He couldn't. Where was he going to get it? So he happily, I think it was a 5 shilling fine or something like that. He said he was happy to pay the fine, and he had the record.
One of the things that's funny is I later looked up a history of the USIS, and the librarians were actually quite explicit about the fact that they didn't much mind if people stole materials from the library, because the whole point was to get the American message out there. And if someone stole it, that meant they really liked it and they share it with their friends, and that's exactly what happened.
And Donegan really did that well.
I'll tell Ron Gould that, but I don't think it'll make him feel any better.
Right.
So the punk movement in the 1970s and the skiffle emergence in the 1950s, how do you see them connected?
Well, I think they're connected in the sense that skiffle was an empowering movement. You know, it was young people making their own music in the same way that punk was in 1977. In some ways, trad had been a little bit like punk, in the sense that the trad guys were trying to get away from the commerciality of contemporary jazz, which had sort of mutated into something called swing. Big bands, you know, crooners. They wanted to get back to the basics of it, and that, in that sense, it's very similar to what the Ramones and the Dr. Feelgood were trying to do just before punk, when they were appalled by the sort of commerciality of guitar rock, and they were trying to get back to something pure. So that kind of is a little bit like punk as well. But the thing about skiffle is it touches on so many of the founding ideas of punk rock. One of the key tenets of punk was, here's 3 chords, now form a band. And of course that was true of skiffle, because you only needed 3 chords to play almost all of Donegan's repertoire. It was very much a hands-on DIY music, in the sense that, you know, they were building their own instruments. A key aspect of skiffle was something called a T-chest bass, which I think you call a wash tub bass. But a T-chest bass was if you can imagine a box, like a crate, about 1 metre by 1 metre by just less than 1 metre. It was used for importing loose leaf tea from India, and they used to literally cut the top off and then use them as storage cases. All of us have them in our attics at home in England, because they were used for storage. But if you tip it upside down, so the base now becomes the top, and you nail a broom pole to the edge and run a piece of twine to the centre and put it through the hole and tie it, you can get a kind of a dum 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 noise. I mean, it's not very in pitch, but it has the effect of that. And so this is what they did. They made these. They made their musical instruments with stuff they could buy in a hardware shop. What can be more DIY than that? You know, if you're talking about DIY. But I think most important of all was the sense of empowerment that came with skiffle. The thing to me that was really attractive about punk was it was a year zero. It was like everything else that came before, out the window. Forget it. I mean, obviously we thought that a bit, but at the time it was like, this is us. We are we identify with this, and we're different from what went before. Skiffle is that times 100, because we're talking about the first time it happened in our culture. And what the symbol of it is the guitar. The guitar is not an instrument common in British culture up to that point. Our folk music was predominantly, if it was singing, it was unaccompanied. If it was instrumental, it was fiddles and squeeze box, stuff like that. You know, there wasn't. Guitars were played by outsiders, like singing cowboys or calypsonians or bluesmen. So, in taking the guitar, Donegan was introducing. He was the first Briton to get in the charts playing a guitar, and it kind of gave that generation of young men a symbol of their difference from the previous generation. So the guitar becomes the symbol of year zero. And I think that if you were a kid in 57 and you saw a sign that said tonight's Skiffle, you wouldn't necessarily just expect to hear Donegan songs. You would expect to hear music played on a guitar. Skiffle means guitar music. Skiffle means a new beginning. Skiffle means, you know, like punk meant a number of things. It meant the Pistols and the Clash, but it also meant Ian Dury and the Blockheads and stuff like that.
Punk didn't have the never-ending punk contests.
No, that's true. That's true. But one of the problems for the Skifflers was that they were so young. Many of them were so young.
Yeah.
You know, Van Morrison was 12 when he heard Lead Belly. George Harrison was 13. Paul McCartney was 14. Lennon was 16 when Donegan played in Liverpool, and they all, you know, Lennon formed their Quarrymen within 2 weeks of seeing him. They were so young that they never did proper gigs like I do gigs, or like the punk bands did gigs. They were just playing in school halls, you know, scout huts, church halls, coffee bars. They didn't make records. You know, there's an estimate between 30 and 50,000 skiffle bands playing at peak skiffle in 1957, but
wow.
they're all under 18. They're not making records. They don't have a career. But what they do have is competitions. There are skiffle contests organised, which end up with some of these bands appearing on TV, and some have promised record deals. But really, it's how they all cut their teeth playing live, and you know, all those guys. I mean, the Beatles failed their skiffle band, the Quarrymen, failed their audition for a national skiffle contest. They weren't up to speed. But interestingly,
it's amazing.
Yeah. Interestingly, it was the whole thing was just a complete con, because the person who had the loudest applause won. So it was, you know, you wanted to bring all your friends. So the promoters made a fortune. But it was very serious. I mean, the finals was in a primetime TV program called Come Dancing, which went out on 7 o'clock on a Friday night, which is a huge. It's a ballroom dancing. My parents watched it avidly. But the skiffle competition final was in that program. It wasn't in some kids program. It was the absolute centre of our culture.
Wow. And there's lots of skiffle clubs too in Soho.
Yeah, well, and around the country, Donegan encouraged people to form clubs. He had a sort of a newsletter which explained how to form a club, and if he came to play in town, he would sort of try and get down there, and they would get pre-release copies of his record and how to play it and stuff like that, which in some ways led to the formation of some of the early folk clubs in my country. You know, the folk revival kind of came out of skiffle.
Can you talk to us about the flexi recordings, the little plastic ones?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
That was kind of fascinating.
Again, there are other similarities with punk rock in that there were fanzines. People made, you know, Xerox fanzines that they sold around clubs. And one band made some flexi discs. A flexi disc, for those of you not old enough to remember, is like a transparent plastic square with record grooves in it that you can staple to a magazine and sell. And the Eden Street Skiffle group made an entire album. It's one of the very few skiffle albums, actually. They made an entire album of these flexis. And what you had to do is you had to fold the corners into the sleeve of the 7-inch sleeve, which gave it some rigidity. Wow. And then put it on and put an old English penny, which is like a cartwheel, and put it on top of the needle so the needle didn't bounce up and down. And they still play. I bought some on eBay, and you can still play them. They still work. After all, it's 60-year-old technology. Yeah. But yeah, very similar with punk. That.
Yeah, I think the point of the flexi was you could put it inside the magazine, and the magazine would flex. It wouldn't crack the way a
stick it to the back of a cornflakes box. They were very popular for sort of kids music on cornflake boxes.
Right. So, so you mentioned the importance of Lead Belly and other traditional American songs, which was a big part of skiffle. There was this other thing that happened sort of late in skiffle that I wonder if you think of it or how you think of it, that it's those songs like My Old Man's a Dustman or Does Your Chewing Gum Lose Its Flavor, the novelty songs that enter skiffle. Is that kind of a betrayal of the skiffle idea?
I'm not sure they're skiffle really, Stephen. I think what happens is Lonnie Donegan becomes an all-round entertainer. You've got to see Lonnie in some ways as our Elvis. You know, he's the very first. And it's worth mentioning that he recorded Rock Iron Line on the 13th of July 1954, just a week after Elvis Presley recorded That's All Right Mama in Memphis with Sam Phillips. So they're almost simultaneous.
You could argue it's like the most important week in pop music.
Could, you could. What came out of that? It's amazing that those happened so closely. But just as Elvis kind of didn't really know where to go and ended up going to Vegas, well, Donegan kind of goes to these sort of novelty songs and sort of betrays the credibility he had, because he has amazing credibility in his early years among the young people playing this music. So I think that because Donegan is the only real superstar and his career sustains after the skiffle star wanes, what happens is it's superseded by rock and roll. I don't think we can. My Old Man's a Dustman kind of sort of finishes it for all the skifflers. It's like, it's over. That's 1960. Although, I have to say, that same year, the Beatles went to Hamburg. And as constituted at the time, the Beatles were Harrison, McCartney and Lennon, the three guitar players from the Quarrymen. Pete Best, who was the son of a woman they knew who played a bit of drums, and their friend who looked great, Stuart Sutcliffe, but couldn't really play the bass. But when they got to Hamburg, there was a Koschmeyer put a wrestler out to look after him, a big old German wrestler to keep him out of trouble. And he was interviewed by a DJ, an American DJ, at the height of Beatlemania in the 1960s, and the guy asked him, what were they like when they first came to Hamburg? And he said, they played too much of that washboard music, you know? He said, those British bands, they thought Lonnie Donegan was Elvis. I mean, the implication of that is that the Beatles were still more or less a skiffle band when they got to Hamburg, because that's not the way the legend goes. And I think you've got to accept that skiffle did carry on after Donegan disappeared, because those kids are they're still playing. They've got the bug now. They're playing guitars, and it's still as accessible as it was, because it was kind of like a school ground, a playground craze. Skiffle. It wasn't like a scene. It was like every sentient schoolboy could play three chords on a guitar, you know, and you had a choice. You could either play football and impress your mates, or play guitar and impress girls.
Exactly.
So you can see the attraction, can't you?
Exactly.
What if you could do both? That would be amazing.
That would be impossible. I've never seen anybody do both at the same time.
So skiffle has roots in traditional jazz, and we'd like to ask you about that, and also talk about the 20-year musician union embargo.
Oh dear, that's a shameful episode.
Yes.
In our history. Well, where would you like me to start on that?
Let's start with traditional jazz, and then we'll move over to the embargo.
What can I tell you about trad jazz? Just a sort of.
I think the fact that it has roots, it's a major root of skiffle.
Well, tell us maybe the Ken Collier story.
The Ken Collier story.
Yeah,
it's such a great story.
And the jail scene too.
Yeah, the whole thing. Well, the driving force behind trad jazz in the UK was a guy named Ken Collier, who's a trumpet player. And he was hugely frustrated by the fact that he was unable to see any of these jazz bands play, because there was a ban on American bands touring in the UK between 1935 and 1955. It was a reciprocal ban that originated with the American Federation of Musicians, who in 1934 said that British band leaders, jazz band leaders, could only tour the United States of America if A, they used only American musicians, and B, if they took out American citizenship. It's the worst kind of protectionism, and as someone who's always been a supporter of unions, you can imagine how disappointed I am, but it's particularly in music as well.
Yeah.
So the British Ministry of Labour reciprocated on that, and nobody toured. So for the jazzers after the war, they couldn't learn really how to play, because you only learn by seeing someone physically do it. That's how you learn. You sat on the edge of the stage. It's what Donegan did. It's what Chris Barber did. All those guys did. They sat there every night and watched as close as you and I as they could to the guys who were playing. So Ken Collier realised that some of the original players, although they were in their 60s and 70s, were still alive and playing in dives in New Orleans. So he hatched a plot to get to New Orleans, except the only way he could really get to New Orleans in those days was, well, it was almost impossible really, because not only because of the travel and the distance and the cost, but the British government wouldn't let you go out of the country with more than about £10 because of currency smuggling. So it's just impossible. So he comes up with this brilliant plan. He joins the Merchant Navy, the Merchant Marine, and goes all around the world until eventually he gets a job on a boat that goes to Mobile, Alabama. And when he gets to Mobile, he jumps ship, gets a tourist visa for a month, and goes to New Orleans, and he finds George Lewis Band, who backed up Bunk Johnson on Ken's favourite record. And they're just pleased as chuffed to see some kid from England who's interested in what they're doing, because they're playing to people their age. They're playing to 70-year-olds, you know, British, African-American guys in their 20s are listening to bebop. They're not listening to old-time jazz, you know, that's granddad's music. So not only does he know their stuff, he knows it so well he can sit in with them. So they invite him to get on the bandstand and play, which is just incredible when you think about it, isn't it?
And how radical was that in itself?
Well, that was very radical for a white guy to play with black musicians, and it ultimately cost him his liberty, because when he went to renew his visa, he was a day late because his renewal date was the 25th of December. Now, normally you might think, so, well, don't worry, mate, we weren't open. Or you might say, I'm afraid that's a misdemeanor, and if you have a misdemeanor, what happens to you? They put you in house arrest in a hotel, in a hostel, and then they deport you. But they put Ken in jail. They jailed him. And the implication is really that they this was punishment for associating with African American musicians.
And he was in jail for a while.
He was
too.
in jail for a long time, 38 days without bail. Now, this is completely unprecedented for someone on a visa violation, you know. And whenever they asked him what we would do if they let him out, he said, "I'll go and play with those guys. I've come to learn." So they just kept him locked up as a subversive, because in those days to make a stand against Jim Crow was to be a subversive, was to be a communist. I mean, it so happened that Ken was a bit of a left-winger, but he was never a member of or any of that kind of stuff, but he knew exactly what he was doing. But the other side of the story is being in jail in Louisiana, you know, that's like lead-belly territory, isn't it? You know, when he comes back to England, who is going to be able to sing penitentiary blues with more authority than Ken Collier? So it's like amazing. So he writes to his brother. His brother gets all these letters printed in the Melody Maker. So his story is well known. And when he comes home to England, he comes like the kind of trad jazz Moses, come down from the mountain with the tablets, you know. And Chris Barber and Lonnie Donegan and Monty Sunshine and Ron Bowden form a band around him, the Ken Collier Jazz Band, and they go on to carry forward the flag of trad jazz, the best trad jazz. And it's of course that band that institute the breakdown sessions.
And so Skiffle comes directly out of their
Exactly,
sets.
yeah, out of their sets, yeah.
So another great connection that you found for the book, which you put in the book, and which comes from the Library of Congress, is there happens to be a terrific photo in our Prints and Photographs division of Bunk Johnson, who was the trumpet player that Ken Collier went to look for.
The hero, yeah.
With Leadbelly playing guitar for him.
Yeah, in the Stuyvesant Casino
great.
in 1947, I think.
Oh,
yeah,
I love
what
it.
a great two birds with one stone. I was very pleased to say that. Find that photograph, yeah. And it's public domain as well, even better.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, I didn't really know anything about jazz, period, and certainly not trad jazz. So I found it really interesting to sort of follow Ken. You know, Ken was my kind of. There's a great book about his life called "Going Home: The Uncompromising Life and Times of Ken Collier," which kind of goes in depth in all that, and he kind of like gave me enough points of reference to be able to sort of work, you know, get off and check out a few other names and try and draw together a chapter that introduces English audiences to the significance of New Orleans in our music. I think it's probably more important than New York and more important than Chicago, really. It doesn't get that credibility, and it's like no other city in the United States as far as I'm concerned. Its significance in those days was considerable, but when it was at the mouth of the Mississippi, You know, it was the kind of permeable membrane that culture passed through on its way to the interior. You know, it wasn't the West Coast, the East Coast or the West Coast that influenced the interior. It was Big Muddy and New Orleans at the end of it. I think people lost sight of that a little bit.
And beignets too.
Yeah, exactly.
Can't forget them.
No.
So we've talked about a couple of groups of people, the trad jazz people, and Lonnie Donegan and his crew. But there was one other group of people that you mention a lot in the book and that you talk about a bit, which is the American expats who happened to be in London at that time.
Yeah, by incredible coincidence, just at a time when Leadbelly's music and Woody Guthrie's music is becoming significant in the UK, there were three characters who just so happened to be in London. The first, and perhaps most important, was Alan Lomax, who, having worked for the Library of Congress since the 1930s, came under suspicion in the years after the Second World War of during the Red Scare, basically because he was promoting African American culture. I think that's all it could have been. And he decided that it might be in his best interest to go abroad for a while. He got a gig making a anthology of world music for CBS, which involved him scouring Europe for recordings, and he based himself in London. He was actually in London when Rock Iron Line got in the charts, which must have been really weird for him. Not only, you know, did he know Leadbelly, but he was kind of, you know, wasn't there when it was recorded, but obviously he took part in the propagation of all that stuff. Ramblin' Jack Elliott was also in London at the time. He really didn't have any profile in the UK at all. He wasn't even rambling in those days. But he and his new wife, June Hammerstein, were traveling around the world, or trying to travel around the world, busking and playing guitar. And he kind of turned up at a time when people, you know, nobody had ever seen a real cowboy. I know Jack wasn't a real cowboy, but he had been in the rodeo. He did run away to the rodeo.
Cowboy,
he was a rodeo cowboy, yeah. And his cowboy persona, I mean, again, Ron Gould, who saw him play, he said he had Levi's on. I'm like, yeah, wow. That's incredible, Ron. And you know, and he had a hat. So it's like clearly, but he had a flat top Martin as well. He had a flat top Martin, which nobody had seen, and he could just play in all those styles. He just was brilliant at it. And Peggy Seeger was also in the UK at the time. She'd, in some ways, the Red Scare had also impinged on her family. Her father, Charles Seeger, who was very similar to John Lomax, was a collector of songs. I think he had his passport impounded. So she decided to cut out and went to study in Europe. And Lomax hooked up with her and brought her to London. And so yeah, they all kind of they took the opportunity that you know, the first skiffle club opened in Soho in 1955, or the first one that we have records for. So, there was a specific skiffle club rather than a jazz club with skiffle in it, which was the previous experience of it. The first standalone skiffle and blues club at the Roundhouse opened in late 1955, just before Rock Iron Line came out. So there was already a scene. You know, Donegan's record appears on the back of a scene there. But you have to, the one thing you have to grasp about all that stuff is the context for British youth. You know, these are kids who've grown up in a time of war and rationing. The war ended in 1945. Rationing didn't end until 1954. So there was all this kind of suppressed sort of want that was as simple as not being able to go in a sweet shop and buy whatever you want. I mean, John Lennon was born in 1940. It wasn't until he was 14 he could do that. So
and they had income too.
They did. Well, yeah. They kind of left school at 15. Most of them. Lennon didn't. He went to art school, but a whole cadre of working class youth left school 54, 55, and they easily found employment. They had money. The young women went out and bought cosmetics and clothes and records, and the young men bought guitars. And I think that's sort of, and one of the reasons why I think they bought guitars, and I this is just a theory of mine, but when in 1955 is significant, it's because when Rock Around the Clock becomes a hit. And that's on the back of the movie Blackboard Jungle, which is the opening titles. But it also doesn't really get played on the BBC. It gets played on Luxembourg, which is broadcasting from Central Europe, and AFN, the American Forces Network. But the BBC kind of ignores it. And I'm just thinking that maybe there was an impulse from them kids. You're going to ration rock and roll as well? Right. You think you're going to ration rock and roll? Right. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to buy guitars and we're going to play this shit, whether you like it or not. I think there was a bit of that in it, you know, because they'd been deprived for so long of the sort of comforts of life. Yeah. And now they had some money to spend. And they were able, through that, to define themselves. That's our first teenagers, and they define themselves. For the young men, they define themselves by playing the guitar. They become visible as a different culture from their parents. And for the young women, they define themselves by colonising the coffee bars, the cappuccino bars. They go into those spaces. They want their own social space. And they don't want to go into tea rooms where their mums took them, and they can't go in a pub on their own without a geezer. So they go into the cappuccino bars. And what's significant about that is that the cappuccino bars are looking to Milan and Paris and Rome. They're not looking to New York. It's quite sophisticated for that time. You know, this is Gene Seberg rather than Marilyn Monroe. And I think that's how the young women turn their back on what had been predominantly, since the 30s really, an American-based culture. And they look towards Europe. That's how they define themselves as different. So this context is really important for that first generation to sort of say, we are different, and this is how we're going to express our difference.
But a really interesting point that you make in the book and that you just made here, which I think seems weird to modern people, is the idea that this was the first generation of teenagers, that teenagers as a thing didn't exist before that.
No, and in some ways, even after 55, for middle class and upper class kids, teenagers still didn't exist. Because what happened for the middle class kids, they tended to go to university and then into professions which deferred earnings until they were adults, you know, like the law or medicine or something like that. So that, because the thing that, you know, as always, what defines teenagers is what they buy, what they consume, what they wear, you know, their style. So this was the first time working class youth had been visible to popular culture. If you look between the wars, there are teenagers, the flappers and that, but they're almost all upper class or middle class girls who are visible to the mainstream media of the day. You know, working class youth are just, you know, they're just a blur. They're not really, they may have had some sort of culture, but you don't really see it. You don't really, it's not a mainstream culture. The thing about Skiffle is it's straight down the mainstream. You know, it kind of breaks into a public consciousness in a way that youth culture had never done before.
Even with guitars, the Skiffle Junior.
Yeah, toy guitars.
Did you ever see one of them?
Yes, I have seen a Skiffle Junior guitar. There's one in a record shop in Denmark Street in London. They've got one up on the wall in a record shop there. And
is it the one with the ears?
Yeah, of course, they're all the ones with the ears. Yeah, it's got ears on it because it was originally a Mickey Mouse guitar, made as a Disney spin-off. And then they kind of repurposed it by putting illustrations in the ears. When I say it's got ears, the body of the guitar, it looks like Mickey Mouse's face on. And it's more like a ukulele than a guitar. It's only got 4 strings. And it's a toe rag to get in tune. But yeah, everybody, it was a total craze. It was really, Skiffle was more like the fidget spinners thing that's going on at the moment. Are you aware of that? In the playgrounds? Yeah. It was much more like that than it was punk rock in the way it grew. You know, it was a craze. Every sentient schoolboy could play 3 chords on the guitar. And what's significant about that is that when Chuck Berry comes along, 6 months later, playing guitar like a ring and a bell, everyone can play his repertoire. And then what happens then is that when you're teenagers, because of that, our teenagers have learned this when they're 13, 14, 15. When your teenagers are thinking about playing guitars when they're 17, 18, 19, their contemporaries, our teenagers, they're already in Hamburg. Yeah. They're already in Hamburg. So what happens is when the Beatles break America in '64, there's a whole cohort of road-hardened bands ready to come piling in and take the American charts by storm. And it's Skiffle that gives our kids that 18 months to 2 years edge on your teenagers who are kind of playing guitars, but they're not writing songs, and they're not, you know, they're kind of playing the pops of the day. They're not thinking of it as a career, where our kids are already focused and flying, you know.
Yeah, what was that George Harrison quote that you mentioned that connects Skiffle, right, with rock and roll?
It's one of my favourite quotes, actually. George Harrison was asked if the Beatles were influenced by the blues, and he said, yeah, of course we were. No Lead Belly, no Lonnie Donegan. No Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles. And that sort of sums it up, really. You know, that sums up how the process worked and how Skiffle was the kind of nursery for the British invasion of the American charts between 1964, when the Beatles had their first #1 in January, and the end of '65. There's a British group at #1 in America for 52 weeks out of 104.
Wow.
And every single one of those bands was originally a Skiffle group, apart from Petula Clark, who is the exception because she, when Rock Online came out, she'd already put out a dozen singles under her own name. She didn't need Lonnie Donegan to
But there
inspire
are
her.
some women in
There are some women,
Yeah.
important women, very important women. Nancy Whiskey, who sings Freight Train, which was a hit in the United States as well as in the UK. Hilda Sims and Shirley Bland in the City Ramblers, absolute key aspects of that. But what there are a lot of, because the Skifflers were so young, 98% of them never made any recordings. Skiffle was gone by the time they were still playing. So what is left is loads and loads and loads of black and white photographs of callow youths playing, you know, cheapo guitars and T-chest bass. Like there are literally every local newspaper in the UK has a file full of these bands because they were big news in the in the 50s. They were good copy.
And they were having a ball.
They were having a ball.
Yeah.
But I've seen loads and loads and loads of those pictures, and I don't think I've seen a handful of women in any of those pictures. One or two bands might have a woman at the back playing the T-chest bass. I did want to come across an entire band of women, but on closer inspection they were actually Irish travellers. It was the mum and the three daughters, and they were just dressing up playing skiffle for the picture. There was a story attached to it, and I don't know why, but it was something that really connected with kids. It may be that it was guys who were playing guitars they saw, whether it's Leadbelly or Brunsey or Elvis or Bill Haley. There weren't, there was no Wanda Jackson in the UK,
Exactly.
So there wasn't the girl singers were, mostly singing with big bands like Petula Clark, and they were, I have to say it, they were rather sort of simpering, whereas the guitar players were outcasts. They were dynamic. They were roustabouts.
Yes.
And you can see the sort of attachment for that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very hard to go back and get into the mindset of what it would be like to hear Rock Online for the first time.
Yeah.
We're so we're so past that. We've
Yeah.
not lived our entire lives in a time of rationing and war. We've not had to listen to everything mediated by the BBC and rationed out to us. So it's hard to get back. You can only really sort of try and look at what the evidence is and extrapolate how and why. So I may totally be wrong, but I do believe that young women were a key driving force in Skiffle, because their colonisation of the coffee bars is what draws Skiffle into the coffee bars. And it's only when Skiffle comes in the coffee bars it really starts to evolve into rock and roll.
Yep.
In that sense, in terms of British rock and roll, Skiffle is kind of the noise you hear on the track when a train is coming in a tube station. You got that. That's what Skiffle is to British rock and roll. It's a standalone thing. It's a completely different thing. And it wasn't supposed to lead to rock and roll, but that's the role it plays. It kind of lets you know it's coming, and it's coming soon,
And what about Stan Freberg and his Sniffle group?
Well, this is another very interesting thing. When Lonnie Donegan has a hit in the United States of America with his version of Rock Online, the great Stan Freberg does a Mickey Take record of it, joking with it. But what's significant about that is the flip side is a Mickey Take of Elvis. And Donegan and Elvis, again, they're as equals as far as Stan was concerned, And Donegan, significantly, was marketed in the US in '56 as the Irish hillbilly. He was neither Irish, he was actually born in Scotland.
Exactly.
And lived most of his life in London. Nor was he a hillbilly. But the significance of that term is that at the time Elvis Presley was being called the hillbilly cat. So this was putting Donegan in the same category, the hillbilly category. And I mean, even people like Slim Whitman was called a hillbilly. Anyone with a guitar at the time in the charts was a hillbilly. It was hillbilly music. The guitar, yeah. That's the jazz magazines in Britain dismiss Donegan having a hit with Rock Iron Line in terms of this dreadful hillbilly music that's coming from America, by which they mean Slim Whitman and Tennessee Ernie Ford, 16 Tons. There was a number of hits in '55, sort of cowboy songs that got into the charts, and the jazzers saw Donegan as part and parcel of that, and it may have been why Rock On was put out. That Decca Records were looking for someone to match these guys, because all the British singers, even when they were singing country songs, were wearing a dinner jacket and a bow tie, and they had no one who looked like, they'd kind of ridden in off the plains. And there's Donegan, and that might have been, that might have been some of the reason why. Because as I say, it was originally recorded in the context of a jazz record in 1954, and then suddenly gets released in late 1955. Obviously, it had rock in the title, and Rock Around the Clock had been a hit, so it might have been something to do with that. But it really is a complete fluke. There's no one sat down and said, right, let's have a skiffle, the skiffle burst. No, it's not like that at all. In fact, the actual record, the 10-inch single of Rock On Line says the word jazz on the label twice.
Wow.
So, and it's an American folk song sung by a blues guy. I mean, it's kind of, well, but the way it comes together it's all just classic sort of cock-up thing. Yeah.
And it's interesting, at one point in the book you describe Fred Hellerman.
Oh yeah, poor old Fred. Yeah.
Right on stage with Lonnie Donegan, and then what happens?
Well, when Donegan comes to the US, although the ban on touring, American musicians tour in the UK and UK musicians tour in the US has
because the embargo's been lifted.
Ended, in '55. Donegan's one of the first to benefit from that. He's not allowed to bring his guitar. He's not allowed to play his guitar. The AFM won't let him play his guitar.
Can you imagine?
Yeah, exactly.
So he has to hire someone to play guitar for him?
He has to hire someone to play.
Right.
On the Ed Sullivan Show, the guy who plays guitar in the band on the Ed Sullivan Show is the same guy who plays the intro to Mrs. Robinson by Simon and Garfunkel.
Oh my.
That's a sort of side fact for you. But
nice.
he does a kind of a stand at a supper club in Brooklyn. And they get Fred Hellerman to come and play for him. Fred Hellerman from the Weavers.
Yes.
I suppose because he's singing Leadbelly songs. Fred Hellerman, he played at Leadbelly's funeral. I mean, he knew Hoodie Ledbetter very well, but he didn't really appreciate what Lonnie was doing with the songs. Because Lonnie's way of singing was to speed up. That was his whole thing. That was what made him so exciting to the British kids. He had a kind of runaway train thing to him. Hellerman didn't like that. He didn't like that at all. So he sadly passed away last year, but I spoke to him before he passed away. And he didn't like Lonnie at all. He didn't like it. And I can understand that, because, he said he didn't, he didn't respect the material and the audience didn't respect it. And it's understandable that the audience came to see Donegan were Elvis's audience. They weren't Leadbelly and the Weavers audience, So what happens is Donegan goes out on tour, on a rock and roll tour with Chuck Berry and Clyde McPhatter and a load of other bands. And he's allowed to play the guitar, but he has to he's backed up by the pit orchestra in every place they play. They play 11 shows a day, and he plays 2 songs, start at 11 in the morning and run through till night time. And he's not getting on very well with this. And when they get to Detroit, the Johnny Burnett from the Rock and Roll Trio, perhaps the greatest rockabilly band outside of Sunset and Elvis that ever performed, say to him, listen, man, why don't you let us back you up on these songs, Because we love what you're doing. And Donegan's like, oh, I couldn't afford that. and Johnny Burnett says, man, it's not about money. Just let us back you up. So they do. They work together. And I think this is significant that skiffle meets rockabilly in '56 in Detroit, and they recognise one another as kin, and they fit together like hand in glove, And in some ways, rockabilly is similar to skiffle in that it too was superseded by rock and roll. And what we say rockabilly means no drums, percussive bass, couple of guitars, no piano, and those kind of things. But what is significant about skiffle in terms of what happened in the United States of America, why skiffle isn't the same? It's not, because there are artists over here who are inspired by that. I mean, Dave Van Ronk, and some friends make a skiffle album inspired by Rock Iron Line, but it's really more or less a jug band album. So you can say that it was influenced, but what is missing, the significant thing that is missing in the United States of America that makes skiffle an indigenous British thing, is an entire cohort of 12-year-olds playing lead belly songs. You never had that. And I'm not saying that out of disrespect. I'm just saying this is the thing that makes skiffle different and special. That's missing in the United States of America. I can't think of any 50s movement that had that kind of reach so far into youth culture as skiffle did, because that's the most significant thing about skiffle as well. It's not what happened in 55, 56, 57. It's what happens in 64, 65, 66, 67. That's the significance of it. It's what they go on to do.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's, you may know better than me, but I can't think of a genre in American music that had that same dynamic.
That prepared kids for
that dynamic. Yeah.
I know.
So what you mean. It's all, and it hasn't happened since in my country. It was a unique moment, and that's the real reason why we need to understand skiffle and appreciate skiffle. It has that depth to it. It's not just a guy made a record and it inspired the Beatles, which is the usual way the story's told.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the process of writing the book, of doing a book. So one of the things that I found interesting in your description to me was your use of social media to connect with former skifflers.
Yeah, that was really great. That was because there's a photographic archive of some of which I use in the book. It was put together by a guy called Eric Winter, who ran a folk magazine. And that had been inherited by Ian Anderson at Folk Roots. Right. And he has a really great Facebook page where he puts up all these old photographs. And he had a specific skiffle album, which had some lovely pictures of Jack Elliott and Big Bill Brunsey and the City Ramblers and all these guys. And at the Skiffle and Blues Club, the original Skiffle and Blues Club, and of course under these photographs in the comment section, there were people saying, "I was there. I remember this. That's me in the corner." I'm like, so I just contacted those people, and was able to go and interview them and find out that from their perspective what was going on, which I don't think I would have been able to do otherwise. But also, I did a lot of research on eBay. British eBay, ebay.co.uk. If you put skiffle into the search engine and vinyl, it throws up all the EPs because they're cheap as chips. No one's interested in them over there. You can pick them up for a $5.
Wow.
And because skiffle comes at a time when they were moving between the 10-inch 78 format to the 7-inch vinyl format, and so what they did was every time Donegan put out two singles, they compiled them onto an EP and put it out in a 7-inch version. And to encourage people to buy it, it comes in a very nice picture sleeve with a lot of details on the back, a lot of information, where it's recorded and stuff like that. So there's a lot of these skiffle EPs out there, and it was very, very helpful for chronology and dating and who played what. And
so people scan the whole sleeve and put it up.
Of course, they're trying to sell it to you,
yeah,
Steve.
right, yeah.
Yeah, they've got everything on there. Sometimes they scan the label.
Yeah.
It's even better. So yeah, that was, the amount of screenshots I probably got more screenshots from Skiffle than I did from the British Library.
Right.
It's funny, isn't it?
That is. That's
really
funny.
strange.
That's great.
And Pete Frame, he has...
Yeah, Pete Frame was a key character for me in this. He wrote a book called The Restless Generation. Pete Frame is famous in the UK for constructing rock and roll family trees.
Yes. Handwritten?
Handwritten.
Those are amazing,
Yeah.
My favourite one he did a Billy Bragg one once.
Very nice.
It was just me in the middle, just said Billy Bragg, guitar, vocal. And he gave it a number, because he gives them all numbers and everything. He did it for a songbook of mine, Billy Bragg Family Tree. Just me, on my own. I was so proud of it. Yeah. And he's a lovely geezer as well. He's a lovely geezer. And he wrote The Restless Generation, which is probably the best book on that period in our musical history. And he dealt with skiffle, but he didn't follow Ken Collier to New Orleans. He referred to that, and he put all the characters in there and was a guiding light for me. But I kind of took a chunk of what he was doing and dug down from there. And a couple of the reviews have compared my book to The Restless Generation, and I'd take that as a great honour, a real honour. And there's a couple of good books on skiffle. One written by Chas McDavitt called Skiffle, The Definitive Insider Story. Chas was actually a rival of Donegan's, and he had a hit with Freight Train here in the US. and another one called The Skiffle Craze by Mike Twohy, who's an academic at the University of Aberystwyth. But both of them experienced skiffle, and their books are from the perspective of someone who was there. What they didn't have is context, and what I've tried to do with the book is put it into context. I'm most proud of the fact that Rock Iron Line comes out in chapter 13. You know, halfway through the book. It doesn't start with Donegan. You know, most of the biographies of British rock stars mentioned skiffle, and they treat Rock Iron Line as a singularity, whereas it wasn't. It was a moment of many forces coming together over a long period, suddenly sparking something. And I've tried to put skiffle in. That's the real point of the book, is to put it in its proper context in British pop culture.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, there seems to be kind of a cyclical nature to your becoming an expert on skiffle, in the sense that, you know, you started out with this interest in Simon and Garfunkel, who had learned from Martin Carthy, who was a skiffler, and something that also struck me was that one of the first hits that was made out of one of your songs was made by Kirsty MacColl.
That's right.
And her dad is in your
Ewan
book.
MacColl, yeah. It is very strange, actually. The way what goes around comes around in folk music. But I mean, I've always been interested in skiffle in the sense that it always had so many similarities to me with punk rock, and I think it really helped me to look at skiffle through that prism when I was writing it, to understand how, because of my own experience with punk, how a musical movement might empower someone, might make you think, you know, I am now at the zenith of our culture, which is how I felt with punk. You know, it had a dynamic to it. So I think that really helped. And in trying to articulate it to a young generation and to, you know, Americans and other people from abroad, I think using punk as a point of reference, at least we have something that we you know, a common framework in which to explain where this is going.
The in the mid-50s, there were over 25. There's actually more than 25.
50,000, possibly 50, up to 30 to 50,000.
So where are they today?
Well, one of them was on the cliff just before I came here. An old bald guy passed me and he said, "Oh, I just read your book, son." And I was like, "Oh, brilliant." And he told me about when he was in a skiffle band. He didn't carry on doing it. And most of them just, that was their moment. Their moment was, I mean, the band on the front cover, I mean, this is a stock picture.
I love this picture.
Yeah, we chose this as it's a brilliant picture of us. But part of the reason why is because in the background, you probably can't see it, there's loads of old people laughing at them.
Yeah,
which
I
is
thought that
just
was cute. Yeah.
really sums up the generation. Well, about 2 weeks ago, I got a tweet from the son-in-law of the bloke playing the washboard. And last week, just before I came, I had a chat with him on the phone. And the band are called the Wild Five, and they're from Stockport, in just outside of Manchester. So yeah, they kind of, in their in their youth, they were touched by fire. You know, and they didn't all go on to play music. Very few of them went on to have careers. But all of them were there in that moment, and that was their moment. It was the thing that they were part of, and they've never forgotten it.
Yeah.
And they're still proud of it. And you talk to these old guys, and they remember it as if it was yesterday. I mean, they won one of the competitions, one of the skiffle competitions.
Oh, that's right.
That's what this photograph celebrates. It was them coming back from winning a competition, you know, and it really meant something to them. And in some ways, it kind of defined their youth in the way punk defines my youth. And I know I bore my family with talking about the Clash and the Jam. My son's like, "Oh, Dad, you know, come on." Would he stop? He's only jealous he never saw them. You know, it's like one of those things. But so, you know, they most of them went on with their lives, but they'll somewhere have a picture they show their grandchildren of the day they played on 6-5 Special or something like that. You know?
That's right.
Yeah.
Are there any skiffle clubs still in existence?
No, not really. No.
Okay.
I would say that impulse has moved on to other forms of music now. Grime would be the nearest to skiffle in the UK, I'd say, at the moment, in that it's invigorating, dynamic, empowering, and allows that black urban youth to communicate with the rest of the world in a way that the skifflers sent out a message there. The grime community is still using music to do that. Most teenagers now are using digital social media platforms, but grime still has edge and still has power. It was the grime artist who stood with Corbyn in the election. Nobody else did, apart from the weird folkies like me. But yeah, it was very interesting because it seems to, it says to me that they're still believe that music has something to say.
Right.
you know, because it's, I don't know, people keep asking me where's all the protest music, but their problem is I think they're looking for white boys with guitars.
Yeah.
Ed Sheeran's over there, help yourself.
Right.
It certainly exists. It's everywhere.
Does, yeah, it is
It's
everywhere. It is,
yeah.
but it just doesn't have the same cultural force. I think music has lost its vanguard role in youth culture. It's still there, and it still has important things to say and bring people together and make them feel they're not alone. But it's not the social medium, the single soul social medium was in the 20th century. We had to encapsulate everything, from skiffle to, you know, politics and football and love and everything. You know, that time has passed.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about a couple of sort of maybe related projects.
Sure.
I'm assuming that the album Shine a Light came out of the research for this book.
It did, yeah. I mean, it was looking at the repertoire of the skifflers that I became aware of the huge number of American railroad songs that there were, and the importance of the railroad in American culture. That kind of got me thinking about making them. And I was already writing the book when I got invited to do a photo documentary to celebrate the 90th birthday of Robert Frank, the Swiss-American photographer. And this magazine called Aperture hooked me up with an American photographer named Alex Soth to go on a journey. And Alec wanted to come out on the road with me. And I'm like, Alec, that is so boring, mate. It's just, you know, day after day. He said, well, why don't we go somewhere then? Where have you always wanted to go? And you've never been in the United States of America. I was already writing the book, and I said, I'll tell you where I want to go, Alex. I want to go to Rock Island, where the Rock Island line comes from. Yeah. And he said, where's that then? I said, I don't know. Let's go and find out. So it turns out it's on the Illinois,
that's right,
Iowa border on the Mississippi. Its significance is that's where the first bridge was built over the Mississippi. And we did a drive from there to Cummins Prison Farm, where Rock Island Line was recorded in 1935. We followed the route of the railway. It's not really there. And it was during that I came to realise that there was only one passenger train a day through Little Rock, which really blew my mind, considering I live in a country where I'm 140 miles from London in a rural area, and there's 2 trains every hour to London. It's just like, couldn't believe it. And when the train came at midnight. The train going to Los Angeles they're going to Chicago from Los Angeles. So we went down there to play Midnight Special while it left. You know, we thought it was funny. And the train came in, it just sat there for 20 minutes. People had smoke, some freight trains went by, and it transpired that there's so few passenger trains that when they get to a railway station where there's a couple of platforms, they have wait time while the freight trains go by. They don't just stop, pick up passengers and leave. They stop and just sit there until all the freight behind them has gone by. And
so they go in the hole, essentially. Like
exactly. And I realised then that we would have, you would have time to get off and find a space and record a song if you were so inclined. And so I plotted with Joe Henry to do that, and that's more or less what we did from Chicago to Los Angeles via San Antonio in March of last year.
Wow.
Thanks to coordinating with the porters.
Well, yeah, we had to talk to the porters on the train and explain to them we weren't actually getting off, or we were, making a record. Nobody seemed to mind. We didn't get permission from anyone. We just went and did it. But 2 guys playing acoustic guitars in a railway station is not a big deal anywhere, is it really?
Right.
That's kind of like,
that happens all the time.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was surprised no one came over and gave us a couple of quarters.
It's the recording equipment that's a little weird, but
but that was just like a tree thing with a couple of mics on, and there was a couple of guys videoing. No one really paid us any mind.
Right.
There were so few people getting on and off anyway. Some of the passengers who were having a smoke come and watch us. They'd follow us in and watch us doing it. But really, no one really cared. They're all busy doing what they do. Buying coffee and stuff like that. Get back on the train. It was a lot of fun, actually.
Okay. A lot of people who tour like yourself and make brand new recordings regularly are usually not writing 400-page historical books. Can you illuminate us on how this happened?
Well, I've been doing this for a long time now. So, sort of 33 odd years really since I first came to America, and I was already doing it for 5 years in a little punk band before that. And when you've done something like Tooth and Nail, which is quite a big project, there's a lot of blood and silver involved in that. You need to do something to take your mind off it, so you don't just fall into the next project. You need to sort of clear the air a bit. So in order to just sort of slow things down a bit, being able to say, I'm sorry, Billy's not available, he's writing a book, it's not actually a bad way of putting off constantly being at everyone's beck and call. So I'd already written a book before. I wrote a book called The Progressive Patriot in 2006. This book, actually, I was a lot more disciplined on it. I worked out how to do it in a way that was practical to family life and getting things done. What I basically did was I'd go once a month to London to the British Library, where they have all the old music papers and jazz magazines and stuff like that, and do some research there. And then most days I would write from 3 until 5, and then from 6 until 8. So, you know, I did all the sort of day-to-day stuff before that. I didn't always, you know, in the 3 till 5, I didn't always find my thread, but generally the 6 till 8, I usually got away, you know, 500 words, sometimes better than that.
Great.
So, yeah, so it was a, you know, and then I'd have a break at weekends and sort of come back to it on Monday again, or you know, there's a lot of reading involved. That's kind of one of my favourite hobbies anyway, reading, so I kind of enjoyed that. And because I didn't know a huge amount about traditional jazz or jazz period, there was a lot of discovery for me as well, which was interesting, you know, and sort of reading. A key text was Samuel Charter's book about New Orleans jazz, A Trumpet Around the Corner, which just came out about 3 or 4 years ago, which is just brilliant. And I was hoping to speak to Sam because he played on that Dave Van Ronk Skiffle record, but sadly he passed away. He passed away last year, I think. He was in Sweden. I was trying to get over there to talk to him. But yeah, that's a really a great book. So yeah, it was very engaging. I really enjoyed it. You know, it was something that I already sort of knew the Ken Collier story, and I knew for the 50th anniversary of the recording of Rock Iron Line, I'd written an article for The Guardian because Lonnie Donegan had passed away, and there was a big gig at the Royal Albert Hall, and his widow got in touch with me and asked me if I'd come along and represent Woody, because Donegan was the first person that put Woody in the charts at home.
Yes.
And I sang Dead or Alive with his old band, and The Guardian asked me if I'd write something about Donegan, and it was literally the week of the 50th anniversary. So I went back to the studio, which is still there. It's now the English National Opera's rehearsal space, and I managed to get in touch with Hugh Mendel, who was the producer. So I had a first-hand account of the recording session, which I think is as fair a recount. There's a number of different accounts about what happened, but Hugh sounds to me the most likely turn of events. So yeah, so I had kind of those bits, but I wasn't really sure how they fit together. And the story of the first generation of British teenagers is kind of out there. You know, some of my relatives were involved in that. My Uncle Dave and my Auntie Chris, when they were dating, went to see the Rock Around the Clock movie, and were involved in turning on the hoses in the cinema when the riot broke out.
Oh, so they were there?
They were there, yeah. So I got to sit down and talk to them about that.
Great,
that was really interesting, much to my cousin's annoyance when she found out that I'd had this long chat. I said to my cousin, I've got it on my phone, Mel, I'll mail it to you. Because they never told me about that, so I'm like, okay, all right, I'll mail it to you. So yeah, but it was great because they'd seen Buddy Holly as well, and they did a bit of that. They saw Cliff Richard, you know, it was really great talking to them. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I met some amazing people. Hilda Sims, who's was in the City Ramblers. You know, she was she was not a sort of, she was a communist, and she'd been to the Soviet Union and stuff like that. And where she wanted to show me where their original house where they lived was near the Science Museum. And the Science Museum had an exhibit of Russian cosmonauts from the 1960s. So I took Hilda, we went and had a walk around this exhibition. It was just brilliant. We had such a great time. And then we did the interview in the Science Museum canteen. She was great.
Wow.
And still is. She's still doing gigs, actually.
Did you record those interviews?
Yeah,
or?
I did, yeah.
So you have an archive?
I do have a little archive, yeah. In fact, I think I might have my Van Morrison interview still on my phone, actually.
Well, you know, Todd, whom you met earlier, is our acquisitions coordinator, so we might put you in touch.
Aye. Well,
Cat is out of the bag.
The good news is I still have, and the bad news is I'm a really bad interviewer because I talk across people. I listen back to it and say, what are you doing? why there's a memory coming there, and you just took, because I'm used to being interviewed. You can't help it. I'm like, I listen back and think, oh, why don't you just shut up? Shut up, Braggy. Let them talk. But yeah, it was great having that sort of opportunity to talk one-to-one with people. It threw up some strange things. One British rock star of the 1960s, who I had a point of reference of him in the 1960s, saying how much Lonnie Donegan was a huge influence on him, point blank denied he ever even played skiffle. And I had to say, oh, okay. He said, not in the book. I didn't put him in the book.
But I've got this picture of you in the book.
I just had to accept that. I couldn't.
Right.
I couldn't really.
Wow, yeah, that's
It's all there.
interesting.
But
Yeah.
I spoke to other people who've interviewed him. He said, yeah, he always does. He's always winding people up. So I was like, okay.
Wow.
He should remain nameless. It's not fair on him.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was like, come on, man, don't do this to me.
Exactly.
You know. So yeah.
So you've got a recent song out as well.
I do, yeah. I've just released a new song based on the events of last year, called "The Sleep of Reason," which takes its title from an etching by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya, called "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters," and it kind of resonated with the events of last year, what with Brexit and Trump. So, yeah, I've started sort of dropping singles now. I've got another one coming out next month and the month after. Seems to be a practical way of getting stuff out there now. It's too much palaver making records. Just put the songs out when they're ready.
So is that what you're doing now? You're doing
one
song
a
by
month.
song?
One a month, yeah, just between now and Christmas. And we'll probably compile them on a CD, probably.
When you heard a band at the Tonder Festival in 2008, what was going on when you heard this band?
I was walking around the festival having a sort of trying to suss out what the audience might be like for my performance, which I usually do when I turn up at a festival. And in the main tent, I heard this skiffle band playing. I thought, blimey, I didn't know they had skiffle still in Denmark on the main stage as well. But when I got in there, it was the Carolina Chocolate Drops, and I suddenly realised that what they were doing is the same intention. I mean, it's not exactly the same sound. I think they're moving more towards the sort of classic string band sound, but the material, the vibe, and the enthusiasm. Close your eyes and you will be listening to the skifflers. Really, I was really surprised by that.
And they come straight here to do their research. They've been in our reading room quite a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and they do a great job of it. Yeah, they do a great job too.
All right. So what is next on your agenda?
Well, I'm putting these singles out over the next 6 months. So I've got the first 3 written. I've got to write the next 3, and then next year I'm sort of looking at doing a bit of festivals over the summer. Got some very interesting opportunities there, and the possibility of making a documentary about skiffle.
Oh, wow.
We'll see if it comes off.
That
I
would
mean,
be great.
people talk about these things and they don't happen, but
Yeah.
it'd be a lovely thing to do, particularly now, because a lot of the 60 years ago, and a lot of the protagonists are old now. Those that are still with us, so it'd be great to get that done, or maybe talk to some of the people like Paul McCartney. I did have an interview booked with Paul, but the 2 of us couldn't make it happen. I never did get around to talking to him, but he was willing to talk about it, so I might be able to engage him.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All
you.
right.
It's been
Well,
fun.
I would like to thank you for doing this interview with
Yeah.
us, and to thank Mary Sue also for being part of it. And this has been an interview for the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. Thank you, Billy Bragg.
Thank you.
Mary
Had
Sue
a great
Twohy.
time.
And my name is Steve Winick.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.